The Orpheus shuddered as it touched down on the barren moon, settling in a fine haze of gray dust that hung in the air like a funeral shroud. Captain Dara Kent held her breath, her gloved fingers tight around the controls as she scanned the empty, desolate landscape spread out before them. She'd been on countless missions to forsaken worlds and forgotten moons, but something about this place sent a chill down her spine. The Hemlock system's light, weak and distant, cast long shadows across the moon's cracked surface, giving the place a haunted, ancient quality. "All systems green, Captain," the voice of Dr. Leon Marquez crackled over the comms. The xenobiologist's tone was subdued, as though even she, the team's most curious and excitable member, sensed the unease. Captain Kent adjusted her helmet's visor, dulling the harsh, reflective glare from the stars. "Let's get out there. We have a narrow window before the Hemlock star shifts and cuts our visibility." The team gathered at the airlock, each member silent as the doors slid open and the lunar dust greeted them, weightless and eerie. They stepped out and the strange silence pressed down on them, thick and unnatural. Kent noted it immediately. It was more than the usual vacuum of space. It was a silence that seemed intentional. A silence that felt as though it had swallowed sounds for centuries, buried screams and whispers alike in its depths. The crew moved carefully across the uneven terrain, their boots crunching over brittle soil. Marquez was the first to spot them. "Captain, you're going to want to see this." Kent joined her, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Scattered across the moon's surface, stretching far beyond the range of their headlights, were statues, grotesque, life-sized forms caught in frozen, anguished expressions. Each one was different, a creature with skin scaled like fish, but with 3 eyes stretched wide in fear. A towering being covered in ridges, arms shielding its face. Another, vaguely insectoid with gnarled limbs bent at impossible angles, mouth agape in an unvoiced scream. Hundreds of these forms, maybe thousands, littered the horizon like some twisted monument to suffering. "Is this a graveyard?" Marquez whispered, awe and revulsion evident in her voice. Kent shook her head, feeling a profound sense of unease growing inside her. She couldn't shake the sensation that these figures weren't just statues. There was an unnatural realness to them, as though these creatures were preserved mid-moment. "Graveyards don't usually leave statues in this condition, Doctor. Marquez, keep your guard up." Nikos, the team's geologist, knelt by one of the figures, a serpentine creature coiled as though caught in flight, its wide, terrified eyes fixed on some invisible horror. "These details," he muttered, "they're too perfect. I've seen preserved specimens, even found petrified remains, but this looks like it could open its eyes at any second." Kent's gaze moved past Nikos, scanning the rows upon rows of figures that seemed to vanish into the moon's distant horizon. There was no visible origin for these sculptures, no buildings, no remains of any civilization. They seemed scattered randomly, with no clear purpose or pattern. And yet, Kent couldn't ignore the sense of design, the almost deliberate way each figure faced outward, as though waiting to be found. Marquez ran her scanner over a tall, gaunt figure with long, slender fingers clawed into its face. The data on her screen flickered in and out, and a strange rhythm, like a heartbeat, throbbed through her comms for a brief moment. "What was that?" Kent asked sharply, catching the faint pulse in her own helmet. Marquez's brow furrowed. I don't know. The scanner picked up something beneath the surface, some kind of frequency. It's faint, but it's there, like a heartbeat just under the ground. She looked back at the statues. Maybe it's a defense mechanism or a preservation method. The rhythmic pulse faded, but the silence that replaced it felt heavier, more hostile. Kent ordered the crew to back up, keeping their distance from the statues. The sense of something ancient and watchful lingered in the air. She felt as if the sculptures weren't just relics of a dead species, but relics of something living, something that still had a pulse in its own way. Let's move forward and take more readings, Kent said, though each word felt like a struggle against an invisible weight. Keep your hands off the sculptures. I don't want anyone touching anything we don't understand. The team advanced cautiously, skirting around the statues and avoiding direct contact. But the sculptures seemed to draw the eye, compelling them to look, to linger on the details. One of the figures had markings on its torso that resembled tattoos, faint but intricate patterns that spiraled around its limbs and chest. Another had eyes that seemed to follow them, though they were carved of stone, or at least something that looked like stone. Each step revealed more unsettling details, teeth frozen in agonized snarls, hands reaching out toward invisible saviors, figures huddled in expressions of unspeakable horror. Nikos paused beside a statue of a creature with 4 arms and a shattered, fragmented face, its broken features somehow more horrific in their deformity. He whispered almost to himself, "What could have done this? What would have created something like this?" Marquez's voice came through, shaky. Maybe they didn't create it. Maybe these creatures didn't become statues willingly. A chill ran through the team, each member feeling the weight of her words. The statues began to look less like art and more like warnings, monuments to something unspeakable that lay beyond their understanding. Kent looked up, eyes scanning the horizon filled with statues frozen in endless moments of fear and agony, and a realization crept into her mind, unsettling and undeniable. "We've recorded enough for now," Kent said, her voice as calm as she could muster. "Let's regroup at the ship." They turned, but as they did, Marquez paused, glancing back at a statue that seemed to resemble a creature mid-run, its body twisted as though caught in a desperate attempt to flee. She couldn't resist the impulse. Her hand hovered just over the statue, fingertips inches from its jagged, petrified skin. The air around it felt colder, and an invisible pressure pressed down on her, a hum that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. "Dr. Marquez," Kent's voice snapped her out of her trance, and Marquez's hand jerked back. She shuddered, shaken by an inexplicable feeling of dread, a sense that she had almost crossed a line, almost been ensnared by something ancient and waiting. They continued their trek back to the Orpheus, but none of them spoke, their footsteps weighed down by the ominous silence. The statue stood behind them, watching, the silent sentries of a dark and incomprehensible secret. Each step away from that haunted field of stone was harder than the last, as though something beneath the moon's surface had sunk its claws into them, as though each of their breaths was counted, each heartbeat noted by a presence hidden in the shadows. As the crew filed back into the ship and the airlock sealed behind them, the sense of unease remained, settling over them like dust from the moon itself. They had barely scratched the surface of whatever horror lay buried on this forsaken moon, but each of them knew, in the unspoken spaces between words, that they were not alone. Something was watching them, and it was only waiting for them to come closer, waiting and ever so hungry. The cold, sterile air inside the Orpheus was supposed to be a relief. The thin gray dust from the moon's surface had clung to their suits like static, and the eerie silence that had filled the barren landscape echoed in their minds long after they'd sealed the airlock. But instead of feeling safe, a heavy dread lingered within the ship, an invisible weight pressing down on them with each passing second. Dr. Leon Marquez sat on the edge of her cot in the medical bay, her gloved fingers trembling as she removed her helmet. She hadn't mentioned it to the others, but when she'd brushed her hand against that statue, its jagged, stone-like skin, she'd felt a strange, unnatural chill seep into her bones. It was almost as if a part of the sculpture's icy surface had stayed with her, clinging to her hand, and that cold had only grown stronger since returning to the ship. As she peeled off her glove, her heart stuttered. Her fingertips had taken on a pale, stony texture, almost translucent, with hairline cracks beginning to creep up her fingers like the fine fractures in glass about to shatter. She flexed her hand, feeling an unnatural resistance, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. Panic flared within her, sharp and blinding, but she forced herself to take slow, deep breaths, her gaze fixed on the unnatural, stony texture creeping up her arm. Marquez, everything okay? It was Nikos, leaning against the door frame with his usual nonchalant posture, though his eyes held a hint of worry. He hadn't touched any of the statues, but he'd been close to her during their approach, and he too felt the heavy chill that had crept into the air around her. The moon had left something behind, an invisible residue that clung to them all. She managed a weak nod, but as she opened her mouth to speak, her lips felt strange, stiff, like they, too, had taken on a heavy, unyielding texture. I don't know, she whispered, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Something doesn't feel right. My hand, my skin. Nikos approached, his brow furrowing as he peered at her hand. His own fingers brushed against the stone-like texture on her fingertips, and the chill surged through him, an icy burn that radiated up his arm. He jerked his hand back, staring at her in shock. What the hell is this? Captain Dara Kent's voice crackled over the ship's intercom, summoning the crew to the briefing room. Marquez and Nikos exchanged a look, fear unspoken but shared, and Marquez hastily covered her hand with her sleeve. Whatever was happening, she didn't want the rest of the crew to see, didn't want to face what was happening to her. They entered the briefing room to find the rest of the crew waiting, eyes heavy with the same dread that had settled over all of them. Captain Kent stood at the head of the table, her face unreadable, her jaw set with a grim determination that barely masked the underlying fear. I'm going to keep this brief, Kent said, her voice edged with tension. Whatever we encountered on that moon is more than just statues. We all felt it out there, something ancient, something hostile. I don't know what we've awakened, but it's not done with us. The crew shifted uncomfortably, each member unwilling to voice the thoughts clawing at the edges of their minds. It was Marquez who finally broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. Captain, I think it's in us. I don't know how, but I touched one of the statues, and my hand, it's changing. I'm changing. A heavy silence filled the room as the crew stared at her, horrified. Marquez removed the sleeve from her hand, revealing the web of fine cracks spreading up her arm. The transformation had advanced, her fingers hardening, the texture of her skin shifting from flesh to something closer to stone, cold and lifeless. Nikos cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. I didn't touch anything, but I feel it too. Like there's something under my skin, spreading, eating away at me. He pulled back his collar, revealing a faint gray discoloration creeping up his neck. The tension in the room thickened as realization dawned. It wasn't just Marquez or Nikos. Whatever they had disturbed on the moon had clung to them all, as if marking them, as if beginning to siphon away their lives, one heartbeat at a time. "We have to leave," Marquez said, her voice desperate. "Whatever this is, it's using us, draining us. If we stay..." Kent's face hardened, but there was a flicker of helplessness in her eyes. "We're already running pre-launch checks. The sooner we're off this rock, the better." But as Kent spoke, a low, rhythmic pulse echoed through the walls, vibrating through the floors and up their legs. A slow, pulsating beat that resonated with an unnatural, sickening familiarity. It was the same rhythm Marquez had detected on the surface, that faint, heartbeat-like pulse beneath the statues. Only now it was closer, almost as if it were inside the ship itself. "Engine status report," Kent barked, her eyes darting toward the control panel. "Now!" But the response came with grim confirmation. "Engines aren't responding, Captain. I'm trying everything. Reboots, manual overrides, but it's like they're locked down by something," said Grayson, the ship's engineer, his voice barely hiding his terror. Kent slammed a fist onto the table, rage and desperation flashing in her eyes. "So we're just stuck here, waiting to turn into them?" A cold silence hung over them. Marquez looked down at her hand, watching as the stone texture continued to spread, creeping up her wrist with slow, relentless certainty. She felt each movement as if in slow motion, her body surrendering to a process she could neither stop nor reverse. Nikos collapsed into a chair, his face ashen. "I saw them up close, Captain. Those statues, they weren't made by anything, at least not deliberately. They looked like they'd once been alive, like they'd been caught mid-scream. Whatever this parasite is, it drains them, freezes them in that final moment." The horror in his voice was a knife slicing through the silence. Kent paced the length of the room, a haunted look in her eyes, her mind racing for any solution. But the truth hung in the air between them, suffocating and undeniable. "We're running out of time," Marquez said, her voice barely audible. "Whatever this thing is, it's feeding on us. We're becoming part of it, piece by piece." The pulse beneath them grew stronger, resonating with each beat of their own hearts. A quiet, invasive presence, marking each breath, each second that slipped from their grasp. And as it did, a sense of despair sank into them all, the cold realization that escape was slipping further and further from reach, as intangible as the stars beyond. Kent's voice cracked as she looked at her crew, each one showing the early signs of petrification. An eye glazed with a film of gray, a hand growing stiff and brittle, a vein darkening into stone beneath pale skin. Her gaze settled on Marquez, who had once been a bright, relentless scientist, now a shadow of that person, hardening before their eyes. "I don't know how to stop this," Kent admitted, the weight of failure bearing down on her. "Whatever that thing is, it's already won." The words hung in the air, final and devastating, and in that moment, each crew member felt the icy hand of hopelessness tighten around their hearts. The ship that had once been a vessel of discovery, a a symbol of humanity's unyielding curiosity, was now nothing more than a cold, steel tomb drifting in the endless void. With each passing second, their bodies transformed further, veins freezing over, eyes dulling, breaths coming slower and shallower. They were becoming statues themselves, remnants of life caught in one last, silent scream. The Orpheus had become a prison. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, twisting shadows against the walls, shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse, as if mimicking the alien heartbeat that now resonated through the ship's hull. Captain Dara Kent stood at the helm, eyes wide and unblinking, as her mind spiraled, searching desperately for a solution. Every attempt to restart the engines had failed. Each system reboot met with dead silence, as if the ship itself had succumbed to the parasite's influence. In the darkened corridors, crew members huddled together, their eyes darting to the graying patches spreading across each other's skin. Some spoke in hushed tones, trying to reassure themselves that rescue was possible, that somehow they could reverse the transformation. But as the minutes ticked by, hope dwindled like the dimming lights overhead. Dr. Leon Marquez was already half petrified, her body stiff and barely mobile, locked in a painful, hunched position as stone encased her shoulders and upper arms. She sat in the medical bay, breathing shallowly, her face contorted in agony as she watched her hands stiffen into useless, brittle claws. Her once vibrant skin was now a marble gray, veins frozen beneath the surface like cracks in an old statue. The parasite was relentless, devouring her with the same cold patience it had used on its countless other victims across the ages. Nikos, standing nearby, leaned heavily against a console, his breath ragged. He'd once been a beacon of optimism among the crew, but now despair clouded his features, etched into his graying skin. "Marquez," he murmured, voice cracking. "Can you feel it? Like it's not just taking our bodies, but our minds too?" Marquez's gaze flickered, and in that moment, her eyes looked distant, fogged over as if she were peering into some other reality. She could barely move, her expression frozen in a half-wince. But she managed a shallow nod. "I feel it. Memories slipping away. It's like it's feeding on who we were." Captain Kent entered the room, her face drawn and pale, hands trembling as she braced herself against the wall. She too was beginning to feel the stone creeping up her spine, the weight of each heartbeat growing heavier, as if her own blood were turning to sand. She'd tried every protocol, every override she could think of, but the ship remained unresponsive, locked in the grip of this monstrous entity. "We're losing control," Kent admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "It's smarter than we thought. More intimate." Grayson, the engineer, sat slumped in a chair near the back, his hands clutching his head as he mumbled incoherently, his mind drifting further with each pulse of the alien heartbeat that reverberated through the ship. "I saw my daughter," he muttered, his eyes hollow. "Saw her standing there, right by the reactor, smiling. But she's gone. She's been gone for years." The rest of the crew exchanged fearful glances. They too had begun seeing things, visions of loved ones long dead, or glimpses of moments from their past, flashing before their eyes as though dredged up by the parasite itself. Marquez, her petrified fingers twitching, felt a single tear slide down her stone-cold cheek as she remembered her childhood home, the warmth of her mother's touch, the laughter of her friends. But each memory seemed to be slipping away, as if siphoned from her mind and consumed by the entity. Kent clenched her jaw, fighting back the wave of despair. It's not just taking our bodies, it's harvesting us. Every memory, every fear, every last bit of hope. It's feeding on who we are. The realization hit them all like a blow. This parasite, this ancient creature from a time long forgotten, wasn't content to simply turn them into statues. It wanted to devour them entirely, to feed on the essence of their existence, their memories, their emotions, leaving nothing behind but empty shells. Nikos, shaking uncontrollably, stumbled to his feet. We can't let it win. We can't let it take everything. His eyes darted around the room, wild with desperation, as he reached for the emergency disruptor on the wall. If it's in the ship, then maybe we can destroy it. Kent's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with surprising strength, though her own fingers were stiffening rapidly. Number. If we damage the ship, we lose any chance of rescue, any chance of getting out of here alive. Nikos wrenched his arm away, his face twisted in agony. And what does it matter if we're already dead, Captain? This thing is inside us. It's not going to stop until there's nothing left. I'd rather take my chances with the disruptor than become one of them. Kent hesitated, torn between the impossible choice of fighting back or surrendering to the creature's relentless grip. But as she looked around the room, seeing the terror in her crew's eyes, she felt the faintest glimmer of resolve. She had to hold on, even if it was just to give them a few more moments of life, even if it meant sacrificing her own hope. But the parasite seemed to sense her resolve, its pulse growing stronger, each beat resonating through her chest like a countdown. And with every beat, she felt her will slipping away, her thoughts becoming tangled and fragmented. Memories of her own past began to resurface, her mother's face, her first assignment, the faces of old friends now gone, all flashing in her mind's eye, slipping away as soon as they appeared. The pulse deepened, resonating through the ship, an ever-present thrum that dug into their bones, vibrating through their minds, swallowing their identities one by one. Grayson whimpered, his eyes glazed, staring blankly at the floor as he repeated his daughter's name over and over, as though clinging to that one last memory. Marquez, nearly encased in stone, felt her mind dimming, her memories dulling, leaving her hollow, a shell of who she'd been. The parasite was feasting on them, draining every last drop of their lives, savoring their fear, their despair, their helplessness. Nikos finally collapsed, clutching his head as his last coherent words broke through the silence. It's not just feeding. It's remembering. It's taking who we are, adding us to its collection. The horror of his words sent a shiver through them all. This parasite wasn't just devouring them, it was consuming their lives, keeping each of them trapped in its memory, in some timeless void where it stored the consciousness of its victims like precious trophies. Every scream, every final moment of despair was held somewhere deep within it, preserved forever. Captain Kent closed her eyes, feeling her body harden, her heartbeat slow, her mind growing dim. But in those final moments, as her consciousness began to fade, she felt one last surge of defiance. She tried to reach out, to touch the minds of her crew, to form one last shared thought, a final echo of who they'd been before this nightmare had overtaken them. They were human. They were more than mere memories. But as she reached for that thought, the pulse of the parasite surged through her one last time, and her final defiance was extinguished, her consciousness slipping into the darkness, consumed, just another voice in the endless, silent scream of the statues. And within the cold void of the parasite's grasp, they were left in silence, trapped in its memory, eternal witnesses to the countless lives it had devoured across time. The Orpheus drifted in the void, a dark silhouette against the distant stars, silent and still, the faint heartbeat of the parasite thrumming through its metal frame, spreading outward, pulsing across the desolate landscape of the moon below. Inside, the remaining crew members had fallen silent, each one trapped in their own body, each one a prisoner of their final moments, the last fragments of their humanity slipping away. Captain Dara Kent stood alone on the bridge, her body nearly motionless, her fingers, once strong and steady, now frozen and brittle, her skin a network of fine cracks. Her gaze was fixed on the infinite blackness beyond the viewport, her vision blurring, her eyes graying over, each blink a struggle against the stone creeping through her veins. She tried to hold on to the memories that still flickered at the edges of her mind. Memories of her first day aboard the Orpheus, the excitement of exploring unknown worlds, the faces of the crew she had come to think of as family. But those memories faded with each beat of the parasite's pulse, drawn from her mind as if siphoned into the vast, insatiable void beyond. Across the ship, the other crew members shared the same fate. Marquez, her form petrified from head to toe, was now a statue in the medical bay, a silent scream etched on her face, her once brilliant mind reduced to a hollow fragment, locked in that last moment of realization. Grayson huddled in the engineering bay, his face frozen in sorrow, eyes turned toward an unseen vision of his lost daughter. Nikos, in the hallway outside the crew quarters, stood caught mid-stride, as if still trying to escape, his body calcified, his spirit lost. The parasite's pulse grew stronger, each beat echoing through the Orpheus, reverberating through the hollow shell of the ship, filling every corner, every empty corridor with its relentless rhythm. It had fed on the crew's memories, their fears, their last desperate hopes, savoring each drop of life as it drained them of everything that made them human. The ship, once a vessel of discovery, had become a tomb, a mausoleum drifting through space, its passengers frozen in terror, trapped forever in their last, hopeless moments. Kent fought to stay present, her mind slipping further with each beat, each memory fading like a dying ember. She could no longer remember her mother's face, her childhood home, or even the names of the people she had served alongside. She was becoming an echo, a faint, fragmented memory within the vast consciousness of the parasite. Her last, desperate thought was of defiance, of resisting the creature that had claimed her life. But even that defiance faded, swallowed by the darkness that filled her mind, leaving her a hollow, empty shell, her body still and silent. And within that silence, the parasite pulsed, its rhythm steady and unchanging, a heartbeat that had echoed across countless worlds, feeding on the lives it claimed, leaving behind a trail of statues, sentinels to its insatiable hunger. It had no name, no form. It was a shadow, a presence beyond comprehension, a creature that existed outside of time, beyond the reach of any known science. It had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen stars die and galaxies collapse, had fed on the memories of beings whose names had long been forgotten. In the depths of the moon, buried beneath the statues that littered its surface, the parasite stirred, absorbing the final memories of the Orpheus crew, weaving them into the vast tapestry of lives it had claimed. Their faces, their voices, their last thoughts became part of its endless collection, locked in its memory, preserved for all time, frozen in an eternity of fear. The statues on the moon remain still, their expressions forever twisted in terror, their forms unmoving, a silent testament to the lives that had once filled them. To any future traveler who might stumble upon this forsaken moon, they would appear as simple sculptures, artifacts of a lost civilization. But beneath the surface, in the depths of that barren, desolate landscape, the parasite waited, its hunger never sated, its need for life and memory endless. The Orpheus floated on, its crew forgotten, their lives swallowed by the void, their last cries unheard in the vast expanse of space. And in the silence that followed, the parasite's pulse continued, a timeless rhythm that would echo on, waiting for the next souls to fall into its grasp, to become part of its eternal, silent gallery. The stars, distant and uncaring, shone down on the moon, their cold light casting shadows across the statues, giving them the illusion of movement, of life. But they were merely echoes, fragments of the lives they once contained, remnants of the people they once were. And as the last beat of the parasite's pulse faded into the stillness, the moon remained silent, its secrets hidden, waiting for the next visitors to arrive, for the next lives to be claimed, for the next statues to join its collection. In the cold, unfeeling depths of space, the parasite lingered, patient and eternal, feeding on the lives of those who dared to disturb its slumber. It had no mercy, no remorse, no end. It was the sculptor of time, and it would continue its work long after the stars had faded, long after the last memory had been claimed. And there, within the silence of the moon, it waited,